It is the 13th day of September 1963, and Obafemi Awolowo stands to deliver his allocutus before Justice Sodeinde Sowemimo. It is generally accepted that a convicted criminal like himself will make a plea for leniency as the learned judge passes judgment on him, not Obafemi Awolowo. He stood defiantly before the court, and with many of his supporters weeping and mourning in the courtroom, he told the nation that the judgment just passed on himself and his colleagues would lead the country to utter darkness. The learned judge is not deterred. He sentenced the former premier of the western region of Nigeria to 10 years in prison with hard labor.
These documentaries by textandpublishing.com are aimed at telling the Nigerian story to an audience that will be better informed about our past and help make our nation great in the future. Share and like our videos, subscribe to our channel, and kindly leave a comment for us in the comment section. Ensure you conclude watching the video. Thank you very much for watching.
As Obafemi Awolowo headed to Lagos as leader of the opposition, Samuel Ladoke Akintola was made the head of government in the western region. Akintola had been the deputy leader of the action group. He became deputy leader in 1953 following the sudden death of Bode Thomas, who was the deputy leader at the time. Akintola and Thomas hailed from the Oyo province of the western region, which was a fitting balance to the Ogun province where Awolowo, the leader of the party, hailed from. Besides this, Akintola had been a faithful party man from day one. He was a founding member of the action group in 1951. He, along with Bode Thomas and Arthur Prest, had represented the party at the center in Lagos. Akintola was an asset to the action group. He grew up in northern Nigeria, so he spoke Hausa and Nupe, and he was often sent to northern Nigeria by the action group to campaign for them. In spite of all these worthy credentials, Akintola was not Obafemi Awolowo's first preference for the office of premier. Awolowo did not think that Akintola could handle the rigor of office. It was one thing to be a good politician, it was another thing to be able to translate political promises into reality. Awolowo would have preferred someone like Rotimi Williams, a leading lawyer at the time and also a faithful member of the action group, to succeed him. Awolowo was, however, compelled by some party leaders to back the candidacy of Akintola for premier. Awolowo's reservation about Akintola could be gleaned from what he wrote of him in 1960 in his autobiography. Awo wrote, "Akintola is a breezy, affable character who cannot be ruffled easily, if at all. His peculiar gifts consist in his capability to argue and defend two opposing points of view with equal competence and plausibility. This quality, backed by his sense of humor and his capacity for nuances, made him an insoluble puzzle to our opponents." Sir John Macpherson, in one of his farewell speeches, described Chief S.L. Akintola as a master of ambiguities. Awolowo wrote this comment in his book as a compliment to his comrades in the action group long before any bad blood existed between them. But one can still discern Awolowo's characteristic frankness when he made it clear that Akintola could be deceptive. Clearly, this is what master of ambiguity must mean. Awolowo knew that this challenge would come with an Akintola in office, but he felt that the action group had enough machinery in place to check any excesses from Akintola. They were obviously wrong. The first visible disagreement between Awolowo and Akintola came on the 3rd of April 1960. On this fateful day, action group members went to Ijebu-Ode for the installation of Sikuru Adetono as the Awujale of Ijebu land. During public occasions like this, it was normal for supporters of the ruling party to hail leading politicians and the king. On this particular occasion, the crowd hailed the king and Awolowo, but they appeared to have ignored Akintola, who was the sitting premier of the western region at the time. Akintola was obviously unhappy with this. In those days, the name Awo was practically synonymous with the action group. Akintola felt that as the newly installed premier, his own name was also supposed to be mentioned. Later that day, the politicians gathered at the home of Chief T.A. Adetola, another action group chieftain. At some point, Akintola, who had been visibly removed from the discussions going on around, lashed out at his colleagues that he did not like the reception that was accorded him at the just concluded ceremony. He explained that as premier, there was no reason why he should have been left standing for that long. Everyone in the house were bewildered, and they wondered why such a remark at a time like that. Awolowo broke the ice and explained to Akintola that he and other party officials had noticed that he was standing alone and they had left their seats to join him where he was. The delay in getting a seat was because a special place was being set up for him as premier to sit, Awolowo said. It does not appear that this argument convinced Akintola, as reports will reach Awolowo eventually that Akintola had vowed that in 1 year no one will be shouting Awu in the whole of the Western region again. Awolowo would later explain that his biggest mistake was that he trusted Akintola for too long. When Akintola came into office, the Western Region government, which Awolowo led previously, had embarked on a lot of laudable people-centered projects. For example, the Cocoa House, a building that remains an architectural masterpiece in the Dugbe area of Ibadan, was still under construction. Therefore, the government had committed a lot of money to infrastructural development and the maintenance of these facilities along with a host of other government-instituted projects. Awolowo had designed all this by seeing how government worked in most of his travels abroad. What keeps a society running are two things: loans judiciously used by the government of a nation and taxes. In 1954, the Action Group instituted a system of taxation that would allow her to carry out her planned programs for the people, particularly the free universal primary education for children and the availability of free medical care for children up to the age of 18. There was nowhere the government could find the resources without taxing the people. The decision of the Awolowo government to tax the people led to the Action Group losing seats at the Federal House of Representatives in Lagos in 1955. It was clear that there was going to be another election in 1960, and Akintola was keen on seeing the Action Group win both the local and federal elections. He suggested to Awolowo that some taxes, particularly the idea of taxing women, should be abolished, and other taxes should be reduced. Obafemi Awolowo kicked against this idea. Awolowo made the point that a functioning government runs on money. If government resources are not stolen or frittered away, with time people will see what taxes are being used for and they will not resent paying taxes. This is how functional government work anywhere around the world. Akintola refused this counsel and led his cabinet to abolish key taxes in the Western region. It accomplished its desired result. The Western region won more seats at both the federal and regional levels, but the finances of the Western region began to suffer. Besides this, Akintola did not have the kind of discipline that Awolowo brought to his cabinet. So, before long, allegations of politicians stealing government funds became rife in his cabinet. The third point of departure between Awolowo and Akintola arose from the two men's diametric differences in the question of political association. The First Republic had three main regions: the North, the East, and the West. Anyone who sought to win elections at the federal level and become prime minister has to work with one of the two other regions. While Awolowo supported working with the NCNC, Akintola felt that the Action Group was better off working with the MPC. Awolowo was convinced that a political alliance with Ahmadu Bello was impossible because he simply could not rationalize feudalism as a political system. Awolowo resented it with all of his being. Awolowo had reservation about the politics of Nnamdi Azikiwe, but he made it abundantly clear to his political associates that he would rather work with Zik than with the MPC. On one or two occasions, Awolowo had to discuss his political views with Zik and found Zik to be quite receptive to sound argumentation. He did not see this in the Saudana of Sokoto. On the other hand, while Akintola was at the Federal House of Representatives in Lagos, he had worked amicably with Tafawa Balewa, even as the leader of the opposition in the House. Akintola was not combative by nature like Awolowo. He often would allow himself to bend cherished principles for a higher goal. If the goal was ruling Nigeria, Akintola did not think that Awolowo's dislike of the Saudana's politics should be a hindrance. Awolowo, as of 1960, still remained the leader of the Action Group, and Akintola had to agree with the position the leader took. Things were, however, about to change in a few months. After the 1916 elections, the MPC and the NCNC had entered into a league to cut down the political influence of the Action Group, whom they regarded as a lingering pest on the country's politics. Two means were devised for this. They were going to destabilize the Western region and take over the government of that region. At the time of hatching this plot, the differences between Akintola and Awolowo was not obvious. The MPC and NCNC coalition in government sought to use legal means to take over the government of the Western region. The matter was so pronounced that Akintola had to publish a press statement in the Daily Times on the 13th of October 1960, making it clear that there was no constitutional provision for the federal government to take over the running of a regional government. This did not deter the enemies of the action group. They decided to bring the matter to Parliament for a debate. On the 29th of November 1960, one Mr. F.C. Ogbalu, representing Awka North in present-day Anambra State, a member of the NCNC, raised a point of order, asking the Speaker of the House whether there could be an occasion when the federal government could dissolve the legislative house of a region in the country and thus dissolve the government of that region. Mr. T.O. Elias, a member of the House and also the Minister of Justice and Attorney General of the nation, responded that the Constitution permitted for the federal government to dissolve a regional government if and when a state of emergency had been declared on that region. Obafemi Awolowo stood up and replied that there was no occasion where the Nigerian Constitution permitted the federal government to take over the running of a region. He made the point that the part of the Constitution being referred to by the Attorney General was put there by the British in 1950 to preclude a situation where a region which had been granted self-government could not suddenly decide to leave the Federation. He explained that that clause was placed there to safeguard the unity of the nation and not for the federal government to dominate a region of the country. The autonomy of each region should be respected, Awolowo argued. It was clear, however, to Awolowo and his colleagues that the mere fact that they were having this debate at Parliament was a pointer to some mischief that the NCNC and the MPC coalition were up to. On the 16th of April 1961, Akintola informed Obafemi Awolowo at the leader's residence that he had been in the meeting with the Prime Minister along with the two other premiers in the country, where the question of the need to introduce a preventive detention system into the country was discussed. Awolowo asked Akintola what he said in the meeting. Akintola replied that he said nothing. Awolowo then explains to him that such a thing could only be introduced to gag their position, which is the action group. This response by Akintola began to make Awolowo suspect Akintola and even believe a couple of the reports that had reached him about Akintola's desire to subvert Awolowo's authority in the party. Events of the next few months will prove Awolowo's suspicion to be true. On the 9th of August 1960, Akintola informed Awolowo that he had chosen his cabinet without any input from the party. Awolowo was aghast. On the 20th of September 1960, the Action Group held a congress where democratic socialism was adopted as the party's main ideology. Papers were presented on the subject and it was thoroughly debated. This ideology was adopted because it was in tandem with much of what the Action Group stood for. However, Akintola and his supporters were obviously displeased with this ideological stance as it stood in the way of the capitalist bent a few of them had. On the 12th of January 1961, Akintola informed Awolowo that his government had plans to reduce the price of cocoa to stave off a loss of £500,000 the Western region could suffer. Awolowo advised against it. Akintola reduced the price and the Western region lost over £1 million in the process. By December 1961, the disagreement in the Action Group was becoming obvious to other members. A peace meeting was called on the 18th of that month, where Awolowo and Akintola made their grouses known to the elders in the party. They were both encouraged to sheath the swords and work together. On the 30th of January 1962, a Federal Executive Council meeting of the Action Group was held in Jos, which was attended by all members of the party, including Akintola and his supporters. The council meeting was ongoing when Akintola suddenly approached Awolowo and informed him that he needed to attend to some urgent matters in Ibadan. He returned to Ibadan on the 1st of February 1962. The following day, the papers reported that while the Action Group was holding its annual congress in Jos, Akintola had returned to Ibadan to receive the Sultana of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, who had come to the University of Ibadan to declare open the Sultan Bello Hall, a hall of residence for students, which was named after the Sultana's great-grandfather. Awolowo and his supporters felt thoroughly embarrassed. The following day, the 4th of February, Akintola returned to Jos, only for him to again return to Ibadan. The very next day, on the 5th of February, this second time he left Jos with all his supporters, including Ayo Rosiji. On the 9th of February, the governor of the Western region, Oba Adesoji Aderemi, Oni of Ife, called for a peace meeting between Awolowo and Akintola. This meeting appeared to have been successful, with Akintola apologizing for his behavior and then joining Awolowo in his vehicle as they both returned to their homes together. Events that followed that day, however, showed that the peace brokered at that meeting was not going to be a lasting one. On the 19th of February, there was another meeting where Awolowo alleged that Akintola had been spreading rumors around, saying he and some individuals in the action group were planning to overthrow the federal government. Akintola denied the allegations, and a few other persons Awolowo fingered as being witnesses to this rumor also denied ever hearing anything of such. On the 9th of May 1962, the Daily Times published a story on the crisis in the action group. The division between Awolowo and Akintola had finally reached the public. A lot of people were worried. On the 17th of May, Obafemi Awolowo and some loyal party members embarked on a public tour of the Osun division, which encompassed Akintola's Ogbomoso. It was a very successful tour, with a lot of people coming out to see the leader of the action group. The following day, Akintola called Awolowo and requested to be part of the entourage. Awolowo was against Akintola coming at first, but he was prevailed upon to allow Akintola to come for peace's sake. Akintola then joined Awolowo for the rest of the tour of the Osun division on the 18th of May 1962. When Akintola realized that he was not welcomed by the people, he returned to Ibadan. On the 19th of May, an extraordinary meeting of the party was called, where the crisis between the leader of the party and the premier of the region was to be discussed. Obafemi Awolowo spoke for 4 hours, laying various charges against Akintola. Akintola was permitted a right of reply, and he spoke for 3 hours. At the close of the day, a motion was passed for the premier to be asked to resign his office. A counter motion was provided that he should only be reprimanded. Votes were cast, and the counter motion was defeated by 81 votes to 29 votes. The meeting ended with the party informing Samuel Ladoke Akintola to resign his position in office. The following day, Akintola held a press conference where he informed the public that he was not resigning his office. Akintola Taku reported some newspapers in Yoruba. Instead, he called on the governor of the region, Sir Adesoji Aderemi, to dissolve the Western House of Assembly. The governor did not respond to this request. That same day, the governor received a letter signed by 68 members of the House of Western Assembly saying that they had lost confidence in the premier and were requesting the governor to sack him based on the constitution that clearly states that the governor could remove a premier if majority of the House had lost confidence in his leadership. The governor of the Western region removed Akintola from office. In his place, Alhaji Adegbenro was appointed the premier of the Western region. The following day, the 21st of May 1962, Akintola called on the Prime Minister to remove the governor from office. The Prime Minister got in touch with the two warring parties in the Western region and explained to them that if a vote of confidence could be passed on Akintola by the Western House of the Assembly, he should be permitted to remain in office. On the 25th of May, the House sat to examine the question of whether or not Akintola should remain in office. The meeting commenced with the Speaker of the House calling on Chief J.O.A. Odebi to make a few announcements to start events for the day. He was barely done with speaking before one Mr. E.O. Oke, a member of the House from Ogbomoso, a supporter of Akintola, climbed on the table and began to shout, "There is fire on the mountain! There is fire on the mountain!" Another member of the House took the mace and broke it. In all the fracas, even a biographer of Chief Akintola, Professor Jide Osuntokun, admitted that Awolowo's supporters were harmed throughout the pandemonium. The people who caused the problem that day were all supporters of Akintola. Awolowo called the Prime Minister on the telephone and requested that the Prime Minister provide security to the House that would allow at least for a vote to be cast. The Prime Minister ordered the police there. Another sitting of the House was called later that day. But just as they were about to begin deliberation, the police came in and threw in tear gas, compelling everyone in the hall to flee for their life. The meeting could not hold, and it is safe to say that Akintola's supporters knew that if the question had come down to a vote in the House, he could not survive remaining in office. He had become very unpopular, and the overall demand was for his removal from office. The Prime Minister made a broadcast later that day and told the nation that an emergency meeting of the Federal House had been called for the 29th of May 1962 to look into the question of the crisis in the Western region. Between the 25th and the 29th of May, when the Federal House eventually sat on the question of the crisis in the Western region, 66 loyal members of the Western House had sworn an affidavit in an Ibadan High Court declaring they no longer had confidence in the leadership of Akintola. Also, Oba I.B. Akinyele, the Olubadan of Ibadan, had invited Awolowo and Akintola along with their supporters for a peaceful settlement of the matter. While Awolowo attended the meeting, Akintola was absent despite having promised to be present. Then a delegation of Obas from the Western region went to Lagos as one man to appeal to the Prime Minister not to bring the matter to the Federal House. They believed that the issue could be settled amicably. Balewa met the Obas for 20 minutes and dismissed their petition. Awolowo held a press conference where he gave a speech he titled, "Let him who thinks he stands beware lest he falls," warning of the dire consequences of imposing a state of emergency on the Western region. When it was obvious that Akintola would not toe party lines, the action group met and Samuel Ladoke Akintola, Ayorosiji, and a few of their supporters were expelled from the action group. On the 29th of May 1962, all eyes were turned on the Federal House in Lagos to deliberate on the matter of the crisis in the West. The Saldana of Sokoto, Ahmadu Bello, was present. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the Governor General of the Federation, cut his vacation to the East short and returned to Lagos for the meeting. And even the Premier of the Eastern region, Michael Okpara, was present. A motion was moved for a state of emergency to be placed on the Western region, which will include an administrator employed to oversee the affairs of the region. The motion was opposed by Awolowo, but it was defeated in a final vote cast. Chief Obafemi Awolowo attended a rally that evening on the 29th of May, calling on his supporters to remain calm. That day, one of Awolowo's right-hand men, Alvan Ikoku, fled Nigeria to Ghana, where he stayed with Kwame Nkrumah and continued the struggle for the action group there. He left the country without letting Awolowo know. That night, Chief Obafemi Awolowo was served a restriction order by the newly installed administrator of the Western region, M.A. Maja Kodumi. Awolowo was to remain in a 3-mile radius of his house in Ikenne. Other action group party members were also served restriction orders. To save face, the Balewa government also ensured that Akintola and a few of his own supporters were served restriction orders. The idea behind the restriction was to ensure that the politicians did not disturb the peace of the land. But careful followers of the event will notice that the declaration of the state of emergency in Western region was more than the crisis between Awolowo and Akintola. The Balewa government had had intention of curbing the political activities of Awolowo and the Action Group, which was the reason why on the 29th of November 1960, the Federal House, after a motion raised by Mr. F.C. Ogbalu from Oka North, an NCNC member, had debated the question of the federal government possessing powers to dissolve any government in any region of Nigeria. Awolowo had vehemently opposed that motion because he was certain that it was a calculated attempt by his political enemies to curtail the activities of the Action Group. The disagreement between himself and Akintola was only a means to an already planned end. Besides, Ahmadu Bello had intentions to get allies from other regions of the country. It was clear to him that if the two other regions came together, they would unseat the MPC government. He saw Akintola as a ready ally and was willing to use him to realize his political ambition, while at the same time, Akintola needed the federal government to protect his government in Ibadan. Throughout the crisis in the Action Group, Obafemi Awolowo enjoyed a certain advantage that many of his enemies may not have had. He had the sympathy of the public, and at no time did this sympathy wane. It only increased day by day. In fact, with time, the usual rivalry between Oyo Yoruba and Ijebu Yoruba was soon eroded away when the public became aware that the people behind the crisis were not Yorubas, but people using Akintola to undermine Yoruba interests. So, as the crisis wore on, people from the Oyo province, where Akintola hailed from, began to support Awolowo more and more. One of the fruits of the support was that there were many civil servants working in either the Prime Minister's office or the Administrator's office who willingly afforded Awolowo and his supporters information on what the government was planning. Awolowo was kept abreast of every meeting held, every word uttered, every document issued, and so on, so that he was always one step ahead of his enemies. This proved very useful for Obafemi Awolowo and his wife, as they often had to move from one restricted place to another. Obafemi Awolowo arrived in Ikenne on the evening of the 31st of May 1962 for his enforced restriction. He used the better part of the next 3 days to sleep. He had quickly conditioned his mind that his time in restriction would be used as a much-needed holiday where he was hoping to catch up on some reading and writing. By the 4th day following his arrival at Ikenne, a deluge of visitors began to come to see him at home. Probably the most welcoming of these people were people from the Osun division, whom Awolowo had planned to visit just before he was placed on restriction. These people were from the section of Yoruba land where Akintola hailed from, and Awolowo had been counting on that visit to dispel a lot of the lies he believed Akintola had sown to those people. Now, these people were coming into his compound in Ikenne in droves, and he was using the whole day to speak to them. It was a very interesting turn of events because in Yoruba land in those days, word of mouth carried more authority than newspaper publications. People who visited Awolowo in Ikenne carried the news back to their homes and won more sympathy for Awolowo in the process. Visits were made much more pleasant with the graceful hospitality that Awolowo's wife, HID, provided the visitors and the support of his family, particularly his youngest sister, Alaja Awofeso, gave them. Just as Obafemi Awolowo had people reporting to him concerning every move of the government also had a few people keeping an eye on him. When the report reached the administrator that Ikenne had become a mecca of some sort, they knew they needed to act. They decided to send Awolowo to Lekki to be restricted on that island. The Lekki of 1962 is a lot different from the Lekki of today. Lekki of those days was an island that was infested with mosquitoes. The building Awolowo was going to live in was the one that former slave traders used in those days when they were about to sail slaves off the coast of Nigeria to Europe. The belief of the powers of that time was that it would be incredibly hard for people to visit Awolowo at Lekki. Awolowo received the orders to move to Lekki on the 19th of June 1962, and since he was already aware of what the government was planning, he was ready. He would have preferred that his wife would not follow him to Lekki, but the woman was totally undeterred. She was determined to go with her husband anywhere the powers took him. On the 20th of June, the Awolowos arrived on the shores of Lekki and they walked to the abandoned building where he was to be restricted for the next 3 weeks. The villagers did not know that Awolowo was coming, but the moment he arrived, word got around that he had arrived. People rushed to the place and helped them ferry their belongings to the place where they were going to stay. The living facility in the old colonial house was terrible. There was no electricity, neither was there any running water, except for a well some distance away. Awolowo's private secretary, Biodun Falade, had come along with them, as well as a few women to help HID in the house. There were only 2 rooms in the building. The Awolowos used one room, while the other women used the second room. The house was often flooded because the roof was leaking. It was clear that the powers were out to break Obafemi Awolowo down, but he was unperturbed. As soon as they were settled in Lekki, the crowd of visitors began to pour in again. Although there were definitely not as many as those who came to Ikenne, no less than 4,000 people visited them at Lekki during their 3-week sojourns there. Before they left for Lekki, Obafemi Awolowo had spoken to the administrator of the Western region that he had rheumatic pains that required that he used a certain infrared treatment where he would need to connect a device to electricity. He explained that since there was no electricity in Lekki, there was no way he could treat those pains, which became acute during the rainy seasons. Mache Kodumi replied that he could not help his situation. Awolowo then decided that he would not be taking the infrared device with him. He understood that he would be convicted, and he determined that there was no way he would be allowed such a device in prison. The miracle of his stay in Lekki was that the pain of rheumatism never returned again. He was completely healed. Another anecdote worth telling of Awolowo's stay in Lekki was the visit of a man who put all his eggs in one basket. One day, Chief J.F.K. Osubodu arrived in Lekki with his wife and children from Ibadan, including an infant. He had reached the place the Awolowos were living late in the evening, about the same time people should have been returning. The man spent half an hour with the Awolowos and decided to return that same night. Obafemi Awolowo implored him to stay the night with them, but one can imagine that the man was concerned not to burden the Awolowos further with his whole household, especially when you consider that the house they had just 2 rooms. Awolowo and his wife were very concerned for the safety of this man and his family because just about the time they left, it had begun to rain with lightning and thunderstorm, and the family would have to use a canoe across the lagoon back to Lagos. Eventually, reports reached the Awolowos that the man had arrived back home safely. They were greatly relieved to hear this report. The restriction signed by the sole administrator, M.A. Majokodumi, on the surface was intended to keep the peace in the Western region, but any careful observer of things could tell that the intention was to break Obafemi Awolowo. While the Awolowos were laboring to survive under very stringent conditions in Lekki, the Morning Post, owned by people sympathetic to the federal government, began to publish stories of people defecting from the Action Group and joining the United People's Party, Chief Ladoke Akintola's new party. They titled the stories Shocks, and they published each defection each day. Obafemi Awolowo reasoned with his party officials, and they decided to expel 52 prominent members of the Action Group. They had those names published in the dailies. The moment that was done, the shocks stopped. Despite the expulsion, having to let go of prominent and foundational members of the Action Group was something that was deeply painful for Obafemi Awolowo. Besides defection to Akintola's party, quite a number of party faithfuls also resigned their membership in the party. The reason that there was no way they could survive in a country where the might of the federal government was against them, along with opposition from all the three ruling parties, the MPC, the NCNC, and now the UPP. After a while, the government realized that it was pushing its luck too much, restricting Obafemi Awolowo to Lekki. The longer he stayed there, the more public opinion swelled in his favor. Also, about that time, the federal government had decided to bring Awolowo before Justice G.B.A. Coker to answer to charges of corruption while he was the premier of the Western region. The Coker Commission was established to investigate financial dealings in the Western region, particularly to find out the actions of Obafemi Awolowo and the way he and his team had dealt with public funds. On the 4th of July 1962, Obafemi Awolowo received an oral instruction to leave the village of Lekki. He was now to head to Ikenne for further restrictions. He spent 16 days in Ikenne, still with sympathizers pouring into his home daily. He was then ordered to head to his official residence at Lagos, 7 Bell Avenue, Ikoyi, Lagos. On the 22nd of July 1962, Obafemi Awolowo entered Lagos for further restriction. Somehow, word had gotten around to the public that he was coming. That day, the whole of Lagos was out to support him. It could very easily have been regarded as the day of his triumphant entry into Lagos. While the government of the day were persecuting him and trying to put him in jail, Awolowo had public sympathy right behind him. This will eventually play to his advantage because while he defended himself both at the Coker Commission and eventually at the Treasonable Felony Trial, Awolowo ensured that the public was fully aware of his innocence. It was not difficult for the people to understand that he was being politically persecuted. The Coker Commission published their report on the 31st of December 1962, where they found Awolowo and his team liable to have used public funds for personal advantage. It should be noted, however, that in the annals of Nigeria's legal history, the Coker Commission is regarded as having been tainted by politics. In 1969, Dr. Akinola Maja and Chief M.A. Shonawo brought a legal suit against the Western Nigerian Finance Corporation. One of the lawyers cited the Coker Commission in his defense. The judge in the case, Justice James Olajide Kasim, rejected this position, explaining that the Coker Commission was never straightforward, that the general public rebuked its finding, and that it would be unsafe for him to use the result of that commission to judge any case in his court. Obafemi Awolowo and some leading members of the Action Group had taken the decision to set up a real estate company called the Nigerian Investment Promotion Commission, NIPC. The purpose for doing this was twofold. First, by 1953, the Action Group realized that the party was indebted to a number of local banks who had lent them money and had promised to waive the interest on some of those loans. By the time the books were checked, the interest of those loans had not been removed, and the party was weighed down with debt. They decided to set up a committee within the party which advised that the party could do business legitimately, earn some profit, and use the profit to offset their loan and at the same time fund party activities. The NIPC were involved in building the Bodija housing estate and many other estates around Western Nigeria. The company went on to become quite profitable, and some of the resources they got were plowed into the 1959 elections, which subsequently became a thing of envy for the NCNC and the MPC. After the Coker Commission's report was published on the last day of 1962, Akintola was restored back as Premier of the Western Region in January 1963. Obafemi Awolowo, on the other hand, was clamped in detention, facing a long time in prison for allegedly planning to overthrow the federal government. Obafemi Awolowo was at the tail end of the Coker Commission when the federal government decided to arrest him on charges of treasonable felony. The government might have reasoned that it was unsafe to leave him merely confined in restriction. They decided to tighten the noose around him by putting him in jail. On the 2nd of November 1962, while still undergoing searching inquiries at the Coker Commission, Obafemi Awolowo was arrested by Officer John Lynn, an Irish police officer who had worked in the colonial government but was still working in Nigeria at the time. He came into the Awolowo residence at Bell Avenue at about 8 a.m. in the morning of that very fateful day and showed the former premier a warrant for his arrest. This was the beginning of Obafemi Awolowo's detention and subsequent imprisonment. His freedom remained curtailed until the 2nd of August 1966 when the Yakubu Gowon government released him from prison. The charge that was read against him was that Obafemi Awolowo, along with some action group stalwarts, had ganged up together to overthrow the federal government. This charge was not strange to Awolowo. When the crisis around Akintola's dismissal from office was ongoing early in 1962, Awolowo had explained to the Oni of Ife, Oba Adesoji Aderemi, that one of the lies that Akintola was peddling around was that he and a few others were seeking to overthrow the government of Tafawa Balewa. Akintola had denied this, but Awolowo continued to insist that it was true. Subsequently, Balewa himself wrote Awolowo on the 28th of September 1962, saying that he had just learnt that some people were trying to use violence to overthrow his government. Awolowo understood that all these were being done to shut him down in politics. He understood the game plan of his enemies and he was determined to fight. If he did not get justice at the court, he would ensure that the court of public opinion was solidly behind him. The whole argument by the prosecution behind the treasonable felony was that Obafemi Awolowo, as leader of the action group, has set up a committee within the hierarchy of the party that he chose to call a tactical committee. The prosecution, through many of the witnesses they had brought forward, explained that the tactical committee was secretive from the get-go. It consisted of Obafemi Awolowo, Anthony Enahoro, Ayo Rosiji, and Samuel Ladoke Akintola. The prosecution argued that this committee set up a group of young men who were sent to Ghana for training. Ghana in 1962 was led by Kwame Nkrumah, a Pan-Africanist who had at one point said that the freedom of Ghana was not complete until every other African country had known independence. Nkrumah sought to liberate all Africa from poverty and disease. Awolowo's action group looked up to Nkrumah as a senior partner in politics. The action group had also adopted democratic socialism as its party ideology, and they saw the need to send some young elements in the party for training in Ghana around this party ideology. One of the people who went to Ghana was Ayo Adebanjo. The prosecution made the argument that while in Ghana, this group of young men were being trained in the use of arms and ammunition with the sole purpose of overthrowing the Balewa government. The prosecution argued that Awolowo had never gotten over the pain of losing an election, and they pointed at his diary, one of which was titled Flashes of Inspiration, as proof of this. Awolowo was in the habit of writing statements of positive confessions in his diary, affirming these thoughts to himself: I will be Prime Minister of Nigeria, I will be Prime Minister of Nigeria, and so on. The prosecution explained that the moment Awolowo and the action group failed at his being elected Prime Minister, they resorted to violence to take over the government. The leading witness for the prosecution was a certain Oladipo Akinwumi Maja. This man was the son of Dr. Akinola Maja, a medical doctor and an older nationalist whom Awolowo had been acquainted with since their days in the Nigerian youth movement. Dr. Maja was a major financier of the action group and he was regarded as the father of the party. His son, Oladipo Maja, had, however, developed some revolutionary ideas and was convinced that he could take power through violence. He had confessed to the prosecution that his ideas were developed along with Awolowo. The prosecution had then reached a deal with him that if he could testify against Awolowo, he would enjoy some government reprieve.
mo bójú wáyé o ayé ṣá málámálá mo máa bójú wọ̀run òkùnkùn ló ṣubúlẹ̀ mo ní ẹ̀ẹ́rẹ́ kíni dé sí Yorùbá o ọmọ aláyé kíni ṣẹlẹ̀ sí Yorùbá o ọmọ Oòduà o.
Awolowo defended himself by stating that the Tactical Committee was a group he created sometimes in 1960 to brainstorm on how to win the next general election now that the Action Group had lost. They came up with some basic tactics, one of which was that they were going to reach out to smaller political groups in the north and encourage them to form an alliance with the Action Group. Another thing they planned to do was to intensify the whole process of opposition, which would include discrediting the Balewa government and proving to the Nigerian populace that they will do better if they were voted into government. Awolowo explained that in the light of some of these tactics, some members of the party were chosen to go to Ghana and learn from Kwame Nkrumah's men certain workable socialist ideas. As to the question of his relationship with Oladipo Maja, Awolowo explained to the court that he had met this person only twice in his life. In the first instance, someone had reported to him that Oladipo Maja was planning to blow up the House of Representatives and would ensure that Awolowo and other leading government officials were on seat when it happened. Awolowo called Maja and warned him not to do anything foolish. He also took the time to report the young man to Dr. Akintola Maja, his father. The older Maja told Awolowo that he and his son were no longer on speaking terms. Awolowo told Dr. Maja that if the federal government learned of this story, they would very easily reach the conclusion that he was trying to plan a coup. He explained to Dr. Maja that his position in the Action Group will very easily betray his son's views as an idea from Awolowo. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened. As the trial wore on in early 1963, Obafemi Awolowo's first son, Segun, had earlier returned from the United Kingdom as a certified lawyer himself. The handsome 23-year-old was the talk of the town. He was heading his father's law chambers in Ibadan and was one of his father's counsel in the treasonable case. On the 10th of July 1963, Segun was coming to Lagos from Ibadan along with the driver when his car was involved in a ghastly motor accident on the Lagos-Ibadan road. It was reported that the driver died on the spot, but Segun was taken to Adeoyo Hospital in Ibadan. He did not have bruises on his body, so people were hopeful that he would be resuscitated. Unfortunately, the doctors said Segun had had a brain injury and was declared dead a few hours after reaching the hospital. The whole of the western region was plunged into mourning. Wole Soyinka, who would later go on to win a Nobel Prize in Literature, wrote an elegy where he cursed the road that consumed a young man like that. His mother, Hannah Didiolu Awolowo, never got over the loss of her firstborn child. Obafemi Awolowo was seated in his detention cell at Broad Street Prison in Ikoyi, Lagos, when some of his party lieutenants informed him that Segun was involved in a motor accident. Awolowo bowed his head for a moment, raised it, and said to his colleagues, "The boy is dead." Even at that time, doctors were still battling to save the young man's life in Ibadan. But Awolowo knew that his first issue had left the earth. He then turned to Lateef Jakonde, who would become the governor of Lagos State in the Second Republic, and told him to ensure that his wife is well looked after. He said it was enough that he had one dead body in his hand. He would not want to end up with two. Segun was buried in Ikenne a few days after. Whatever public sympathy Awolowo had was at this time doubled because the Yoruba people concluded that the same evil powers that sought to destroy this father had now killed the son. Obafemi Awolowo never believed that anyone killed his son. He had a firm belief in the providence of God. He made it clear that God had given him the privilege of bringing that bright young man into the world, and in God's time, he took him. Awolowo held the belief that people do not die as such. They only take up a new form and begin to live again in a new world. Awolowo was a firm believer in the Bible, and he understood that there is life after death. Many people who saw him after the loss of his son wondered about the kind of fortitude he had in handling his loss. Obafemi Awolowo believed a lot in building a man's spirit up. He understood that a strong man was a person whose spirit could handle adversity. Segun's death never dented Awolowo's belief that God would bring justice to the predicament he was in at the moment. His only concern was for his wife. He sincerely hoped she will find the inner strength to handle the loss of her son. Matters did not improve because eventually, despite his personal tragedy, Obafemi Awolowo was found guilty of planning to overthrow the government of Tafawa Balewa and was sentenced to 10 years in prison with hard labor. The judge, Justice George Sodeinde Sowemimo, believed the testimony of the prosecution and said that Obafemi Awolowo and his colleagues failed to prove their case in court. Before a judgment of this kind is passed, the accused is usually called upon to make an allocutus. Most of the time, people use this moment to make a tearful appeal to the judge to temper justice with mercy. Obafemi Awolowo did not do this. For his allocutus, Obafemi Awolowo made it clear that he did not agree with the judgment of the learned judge, and he would certainly be pursuing an appeal. He went on to enumerate all that he, along with other nationalists, have done to secure independence for Nigeria, and he pointed out the irony that he has, as of that time, spent more time in bondage than free in an independent Nigeria. Obafemi Awolowo then warned of the harm that will befall Nigeria as a result of his imprisonment. First, he explained that his contribution to an independent Nigeria will be lost for a season. Second, the present crisis in the Western region may spread to other parts of the country. Third, the country's democracy will enter a period of utter darkness. However, after darkness will come a glorious dawn. He then submitted himself to whatever sentence the judge might wish to pass on him. As he did this, the whole court was plunged into crying and wailing. In response to Awolowo, Justice Sowemimo said this: "Here we have one of the first premiers of the autonomous region standing trial. If you were the only one standing before me, I would have felt that it was enough for you to have undergone the strain of the trial. I would have asked you to go. But I am sorry, I cannot do so now because my hands are tied." Following the judgment, the trial judge, Justice Sowemimo, headed towards Ikeja Airport. The Daily Express of Friday, 13th of September and Saturday, 14th September, as well as Tuesday, 17th September 1963, reported that Justice Sowemimo took a London-bound plane from Lagos and stopped at Kano. From Kano, he took a chartered aircraft to Kaduna, where he was a guest of the Sultana of Sokoto. The reports had it that he stayed at a heavily guarded guest lodge, one of the Prime Minister's houses, opposite the Kaduna race course. He was in Kaduna until Sunday morning, when he returned to Lagos under heavy security. Those who had surmised that the judge was acting out a script that was written out for him would not have been wrong at all. The people convicted with Obafemi Awolowo on the 13th of September 1963 included Michael Omishade, Gabi Soshore, Samuel Onitiri, Sebastian Omoren, Sunday Ibia Toma, Lateef Jakonde, Uzodinma Nwabiala, S. Oyesile, and Samuel Adesoya Otunbanjo. Anthony Enahoro had gone on exile to the United Kingdom, where he was deported by the British to stand trial for treason in Nigeria. He was convicted in a separate trial. S.G. Ikoku, Ayo Adebanjo, and James Aluko were convicted in absentia. Awolowo returned to Broad Street Prison in Lagos as a convicted prisoner. Prior to that time, he was a prisoner awaiting trial. As a convict, he had lost a lot of the privileges he had as prisoner awaiting trial, but he was still determined to face prison life with grace and fortitude. The following day, Awolowo was given some prison clothing to wear. None of them fitted him. Eventually, the prison authorities designed a certain French suit for him, which he wore throughout his stay as a convict there. He was then led to see the superintendent of prison, Mr. Ogundaunsi. At the outset, Mr. Ogundaunsi decided to treat Awolowo as any other common criminal. He left him standing without offering him a chair as he spoke to him. He asked Awolowo if there was any kind of work he preferred to do in prison. Awolowo told him he could do anything allotted to him. While avoiding Awolowo's eyes, he reminded the former premier, who at this time was 54 years old, that he had been sentenced to hard labor and the prison would ensure he had a full dose of it. Awolowo kept his eyes on him, daring him to bring the worst he had. At some point during Ogundaunsi's speech, the prison superintendent could no longer keep up with the facade of machismo again. He simply broke down and wept. He then apologized to Awolowo and offered him a seat. He explained to him that the prison authorities would not be putting him under any kind of hard labor. He understood that he had been humiliated enough being convicted like a common criminal. They asked him what his choice of reading would be, and they helped to set up a reading room for him where he could do his writing and research. In prison, Obafemi Awolowo researched constitutions around the world and wrote Thoughts on Nigerian Constitution, where he argued earnestly that only a federal constitution will work for a multinational, multilingual nation like Nigeria. The book was published in 1966 before he was released from prison, and it was dedicated to the memory of Segun Awolowo. In prison also, most of the materials that made up the book, The Strategy and Tactics of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, which was published in 1970, were researched. Thankfully, after that foul encounter Awolowo had with Ogundaosi, he never had issues again with prison authorities. Ogundaosi returned the following day and apologized again. He said his wife, who was an ardent fan and follower of Awolowo, had rebuked him and demanded he apologized to the former premier. Awolowo accepted his apologies. Awolowo's time in prison, except for the curtailing of his freedom, was not entirely bad. He had the cooperation of both officers and inmates. Obafemi Awolowo would usually not interfere with banters of inmates, but when it was late in the night and the noise they were all making was getting too much, he would simply tap on the iron rod in front of his cell and there would be perfect silence for the rest of the night. In July 1964, the decision was reached by prison authorities to transfer Obafemi Awolowo from Ikoyi prisons to Calabar prisons. There had been unending rumors that some people were not satisfied that Awolowo was even breathing in prison. These people had concluded that he should be killed. The director of prisons, Chief Giwa Osage, had put in a mechanism to ensure that Awolowo's food was not poisoned. He went to great lengths to ensure that his word was kept safe. He, however, felt that if the politicians compelled his hands, he would not be able to refuse them. Reports had it that some politicians in the country would have preferred that Awolowo was taken to the north. Chief Osage then took the initiative to send him to Calabar. At the same time, in July 1964, things were not working out in the coalition between the NCNC and the MPC. Because of the widespread rigging that characterized voting, especially in northern Nigeria, Zik refused to call Balewa to form a government, and for 4 days in January 1964, Nigeria was without leadership. Eventually, Zik gave in and the government was formed. At that time, Zik put his foot down and insisted that Obafemi Awolowo should not be sent to northern Nigeria to serve his prison term there. He instead supported the idea of sending him to the Far East. In prison, Obafemi Awolowo took time out to do a lot of reading. He brushed up his economics and got textbooks that taught new economic concepts, different from those he had learned in school that had very little mathematics in them. He also improved on his algebra. In fact, Obafemi Awolowo was solving an algebraic question when the Assistant Superintendent of Prisons, Mr. P.O. Okotie, came into his cell and told him that Akintola, Balewa, and Okotiebo had been assassinated. Awolowo sat there for about an hour, and when he resumed solving the question, he just could not concentrate. He had to abandon it all. Awolowo also studied books with the title Teach Yourself series. With these books, he learned biology, physiology, anatomy, physics, chemistry, mechanics, and anthropology. In fact, after he was released from prison, and when he was not involved with politics, he set up a small laboratory in his home in Ibadan and did some research, often finding help from the lecturers at the University of Ibadan. Awolowo also set out to read the Bible in prison, but he did not succeed at completing this project. Obafemi Awolowo used his time in prison to build a code of personal discipline for himself. He made up his mind that if ever he was delivered from his current tribulation, he would not pursue retribution. He determined to forgive all his enemies even beforehand. Obafemi Awolowo was certainly not a perfect human being, but he had a keen sense of discernment on what was good and what was evil, and he chose, as much as he had power within him, to do good to all. Many people understood this, and this is why public opinion very easily swung in his favor during the time of his persecution. Even the democratic socialism ideology that was adopted by the Action Group was only an English phrase to describe the concept of Afenifere which the people of the Western region had come to know the Action Group for. Between 1985 and 1993, Nigeria was led by the military government of Ibrahim Babangida, Babangida said that Obafemi Awolowo was the main issue in Nigerian politics. Incidentally, while IBB was only realizing this in the 1980s, Awolowo had also been the main issue in Nigerian politics in the 1960s. Whether free or incarcerated, every political decision revolved around the person and political theory that Awolowo represented. The last federal elections in the country came up in 1959, and 1964 was going to be the next election. The country was divided politically, and politicians understood that whoever would take the center must work in alliance with other political groups. Nnamdi Azikiwe had resigned from politics, and he sat in the Governor General's office. The office was akin to something of the royal stool that the Queen sat on in England. Before the election, Akintola, who had been reinstated Premier of the Western region, gave in to calls for the creation of the Midwestern state. When the election was held in the Midwest, the NCNC came to power there. There was, however, some disagreement among the NCNC members. Those in the West preferred an alliance with Akintola's NNDP. Those in the East, led by the Premier Michael Okpara, preferred an alliance with the Action Group in the West. At that time, Obafemi Awolowo's wife, Hannah, had become the face of the Action Group. The Action Group believed that if they could win either the federal or regional election, they then could effect the release of Obafemi Awolowo. Therefore, as the 1964 federal election drew near, the MPC came into alliance with Akintola's NNDP and the western wing of the NCNC and called the alliance the Nigerian National Alliance, NNA. On the other hand, the eastern wing of the NCNC came into alliance with the Action Group, NEPU, and the UMBC to form the United Progressive Grand Alliance, UPGA. As election day drew near, reports of mass rigging were coming from northern Nigeria, with many candidates being returned unopposed to the NNA, while the UPGA had candidates for the same seats. When the reports were not attended to, UPGA refused to allow elections to be held in the eastern parts of Nigeria. Elections also did not hold in Lagos and many parts of the southwest. Yet, the Balewa government, which stood dissolved at that time, insisted on accepting the result, which were widely discredited. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the nation's Governor General, refused to call Balewa to form a government, but eventually acceded to pressure all around him. At this time, there were many questions going on around in the Nigerian military and quite a number of rumors about a potential military takeover. Even with the country having to accede to a discredited federal election, the people of Western Nigeria had still not given up hope of seeing Obafemi Awolowo released from prison. Regional elections were slated for October 1965, and Akintola's NNA was confident of winning the elections. They understood that they were quite unpopular, but they were counting on the federal might to keep themselves in government. Akintola was heard boasting that whether the people voted them in or not, they will still rule the region. Elections were held and the NNA won with a landslide. There were obvious cases of rigging, with candidates' names being substituted at the last moment when results were yet to be announced. This singular event dashed the hopes of the people of the Western region, and they then took laws into their hands. There was widespread rioting, burning of political enemies' homes, and even killing in many parts of the West. The people had had enough. If they could not have a say in who governed them, then there was not going to be a country to govern. At the height of the crisis, a pre-recorded tape of the premier was to be played at the Western Broadcasting House. Just at the time the tape was to be slipped in, a lone gunman came into the radio station and told the operator to play his own tape instead. The gunman's tape was a recording of the true result that was emerging from polling stations all around Western region. The tape had played for close to 15 minutes before the authorities knew what was happening. They never found who the lone gunman was. Wole Soyinka was touted to be this person. He was arrested and was charged before Justice Kayode Esho. Young and radical Kayode Esho refused to toe the lines of politics and declared that the prosecutors had not proven their case. Wole Soyinka was discharged and acquitted. Kayode Esho, on the other hand, almost got his legal career ruined. This was the situation in the country when two opposing camps in the Nigerian military arose. One of them was led by Brigadier Mamalari and was sympathetic to the Balewa government. They were to move into the political climate of the West and crush all dissent. The other group was led by Major Ifeanyi Efeajona. They were to carry out a revolution in the country. The latter struck first. Obafemi Awolowo created the Nigerian Tribune with the express aim of informing the public. Awolowo understood that there is nothing that can stop a mind that is educated. He knew the Yorubas to be very independent in their thinking. Despite the popularity of the action group in the West, many Yorubas still chose to associate and belong to the NCNC, which was led mostly by people from the eastern parts of Nigeria at the time. It was this understanding of the Yorubas that Awolowo took advantage of during his trial. He ensured that he spoke to the public more than he spoke to those who were judging his case. He understood that he had already been condemned by the powers that be, but he trusted that public opinion would undermine the powers of any government. During his trial, a young Nigerian military officer had just been posted to Lagos to pioneer an intelligence unit in the Nigerian army. That young man's name was Chukwuma Kaduna Nzeogu. Nzeogu hailed from the Midwest, although he was born and bred in Kaduna. His nickname, Kaduna, was a pointer to the fact that he was more Hausa in person than anything else. At the time of Awolowo's trial, Nzeogu was the man the military posted to the courts to observe proceedings. Nzeogu had been exposed to socialist ideas during his training in the United Kingdom, and he had great sympathy for Obafemi Awolowo. Besides, everyone could tell that Awolowo was obviously being politically persecuted. Awolowo's records in government were obvious to everybody. The Western region was the most progressive part of Nigeria, and it was all owing to the government of the action group. Nzeogu, in his free time, would often share his ideas with his friends in the military, and soon enough he discovered two of them who shared revolutionary thoughts with him. These were Ifeanyi Ifejuna and Adewale Ademoyega. The trio began to plan to overthrow the Balewa government in 1962. In 1965, they understood that if they would carry out the revolution at all, it must be done right away. They also had intelligence reports that the Balewa government was planning a heavy crackdown on the opposition in the West. They needed to strike first. On the morning of the 15th of January 1966, the boys carried out a coup. Nzeogu led efforts in Kaduna, while Ademoyega and Ifejuna led the revolution in Lagos. At the close of the day, Ahmadu Bello was killed in his home by Chukwuma Nzeogu. Tafawa Balewa was shot dead by a team led by Adewale Ademoyega. Captain Uwobosi was sent to Ibadan from Abeokuta garrison to kill Samuel Ladoke Akintola, and in one night, all these men were killed. The coup plotters had allegedly planned to release Obafemi Awolowo and persuade him to lead the federal government. However, the young man who was supposed to fly to Calabar to pick him up failed to show up for the push. Nigerians woke up on the morning of the 15th of January 1966 to hear that the government of Tafawa Balewa had been overthrown. Immediately, the head of the Nigerian military, Major General Aguiyi-Ironsi, was installed as the head of the government. The planners of the coup were arrested, but they were not executed. The reason for this was that the coup in the first 6 months was generally regarded as a revolution of some sort, and public opinion was heavily on the side of the coup plotters. Many people, including folks in northern Nigeria, agreed that some of their leaders had overdone things and that a corrective measure like this was needed. The narrative that the coup was an Igbo coup took up a life of its own after Ironsi became more and more lethargic in carrying out decisions. One of the decisions that could have helped Ironsi was if he had released Obafemi Awolowo. If Ironsi had succeeded in bringing Awolowo into his administration, he would have effectively brought eastern Nigeria into league with the western part of the country. Ironsi sent a delegation to Awolowo in Calabar and told him that if he wrote a letter asking for pardon, he would be granted one. Awolowo wrote that letter on behalf of himself and his colleagues. Yet, the government did not act decisively enough. It must be stated, however, that the decision to release Obafemi Awolowo from prison was actually passed by the Aguiyi-Ironsi's regime. Unfortunately, Ironsi was killed in a counter-coup on the 29th of July 1966, just a few days after this decision was reached. 3 days later, Awolowo and his colleagues were released from prison by the Yakubu Gowon administration. That singular action of granting Awolowo freedom put Western region in a possible league with the northern part of the country.
Yeah.
yeyeye àwa máa ṣe ọ̀rọ̀ láǹfẹ̀ Yorùbá ń ṣera wọn nítorí owó Yorùbá ń kíra wọn lẹ́sẹ̀ nítorí ipò wọ́n fẹ́ fi páláre wọ́n gbàlè fẹ́lẹ́ bí wọ́n kò lè kó wájà wọ́n tún kó lóko wá mú.